Good evening and welcome to the 2026 Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame induction ceremony honoring Keith McCaffery. I'm Marco Machete, the past board president for the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame, and we're thrilled to have you all here this evening as we learn and celebrate about Keith's career as a pioneering and recognized deer biologist in the state of Wisconsin. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the program.
The Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame Foundation was created in 1984 to encourage the growth and practice of a conservation ethic as a legacy for the people of Wisconsin, just as our inductees did. The Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame is a nonprofit organization guided by a board of directors. Voting member organizations represent more than 30 conservation organizations from around the state. Each year, the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inducts up to 3 people. To date, there are over 108 inductees who have been honored. You can learn about each of these conservation champions on the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame website. Any person, group of people, or organization can nominate someone for induction into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Nominees have many environmental and conservation backgrounds and varying types of education and experience. From writers to artists, educators to policymakers, from researchers and managers, Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame heroes come from all backgrounds and walks of life. The Hall of Fame accomplishes its mission of advancing the conservation ideal by inducting individuals who have contributed significantly to conservation in Wisconsin and the nation. Based on standards and criteria set forth by the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame Board of Directors, all inductees must have significant ties to Wisconsin, and their contributions must have wide-reaching impact affecting a range of natural resources. To maintain objectivity in the selection of inductees, a Board of Governors was created to recommend inductees for selection. Each summer, a 5-member Board of Governors reviews nominations. The highly esteemed governors are an independent body and have in-depth knowledge of Wisconsin's conservation history. The governors select nominations to move forward to the Board of Directors and voting member organizations for their consideration. The board members and organization representatives select the upcoming year's inductees from that list of finalists at their annual selection meeting. While voting membership in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame is only open to organizational members of the foundation, individuals may participate in the mission by providing annual support. The financial support of member organizations and individuals allows the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame to celebrate, advance, and share Wisconsin's conservation legacy as it hosts induction ceremonies and maintains inductee archives. Going forward, the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame strives to share stories of our inductees through the website and outreach programs to inspire the next generation of conservation heroes. We invite you to learn more about the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame and Wisconsin's conservation heritage by visiting our website at WCHF.org.
We now have a video which highlights some of Keith's favorite and most memorable moments throughout his career. We hope you enjoy. At this time, we would like to give a special thanks to the many sponsors that helped make this induction ceremony possible. Induction ceremony sponsorships are one of the primary sources of revenue for the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. It wouldn't be possible to continue honoring the icons of Wisconsin conservation without these generous supporters. Thank you so very much. Our first speaker is Tim Van Deelen, professor and chair of the Department of Ecology at UW-Madison. Dr. Van Deelen followed Keith at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources.
I first knew of Keith by reputation and by his presence in the scientific literature, but I first met Keith when I was a graduate student conducting deer research in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was invited to speak on my research at the 1994 meeting of the Midwest Deer and Turkey Working Group, a group of agency specialists on deer and turkey management who met each year to have open discussions apart from administrators and university types. These meetings were where top professionals traded notes. My introduction to Keith was to find him holding court among the other state's experts, fielding questions and driving a lively conversation with his characteristic wit and good humor. At the time, Wisconsin's deer management program was seen as the model program among the big deer states, almost entirely a result of Keith's attention and design. I got my start in Wisconsin in 2001 when I was hired to replace Keith as the DNR's research specialist for deer, following Keith's retirement. I use quotes here because, as Keith will tell you, he was a retirement failure. While I worked for DNR and long after I left for the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW, Keith continued to go to work nearly every day as a volunteer, often maintaining online conversations with deer specialists throughout North America and Europe. I had the happy and fortunate opportunity to share an office with Keith during my time at DNR, and he taught me the nuances of deer management in Wisconsin, its history, its policy minefields, and its iconic importance to the people of Wisconsin. I learned from Keith the professional habits that make one an effective and influential public servant in the conservation world. Keith lived these principles, and a short list would include an unwavering devotion to the health of Wisconsin's deer herd and forests, commitment to the point of personal sacrifice to staying current with evolving science and evolving public policy concerns, loyalty to and support of one's coworkers, good humor, good faith, and honesty at all times, and generosity to young people. Even with the changes pushed on the DNR after 2012, Wisconsin remains a destination deer hunting state. On a per hunter basis, we harvest more Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young trophy deer than our peer states year after year. We also have higher harvest rates overall, meaning more venison in the freezer. And despite having more hunters per unit area, we have the same success rates as other states. This isn't an accident of geography, since we routinely surpass both Michigan and Minnesota in deer hunting metrics. The robust success of deer management in Wisconsin is a legacy of Keith McCaffery's influence in its design and traditions. Today, Keith is, quite literally, the living institutional memory of Wisconsin's professional deer management programs. It's almost a parlor trick among managers, but Keith can remember hunting season details, weather details, and related harvest details for discrete yearly hunting seasons going back over 3 or 4 decades. That only happens when one has an outsized personal investment and commitment to conservation. It's notable that Wisconsin's county deer advisory committees and Conservation Congress initiatives in recent years frequently discuss and suggest returning to McCaffery-era deer management hallmarks when they recognize that deer management is not as easy as it looks. Examples include in-person registration, earn-a-buck, higher doe harvests. Keith continues to volunteer with the DNR. He continues to deer hunt each year. He's been down here to Madison many times to teach my students first-person observations of deer management and conservation history. Keith is a tireless letter writer and phone caller on behalf of responsible conservation policy. Keith is reliable and active as a leader in our state chapter of the Wildlife Society, which is the Wildlifers Professional Society. And until recently, he reliably traveled to our meetings without the institutional support that other professionals enjoy. Keith is a friend of mine, and I love to find opportunities in professional settings to introduce him as my mentor. It embarrasses him. He's also a self-effacing Lutheran, but I mean it. In preparation for this, I reviewed the honorees in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Keith is clearly worthy to be among them. I congratulate the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame for providing Keith the well-deserved honor of being recognized with inclusion. One doesn't become a wildlife biologist to get rich. I tell my students every year that despite this, one of the rewards of working in wildlife conservation, a field that's hard to break into, is that one gets to work with brilliant, committed people who share your values. That is a different kind of richness, one that I would argue is even more valuable. Keith is the archetype of that for me.
Our next speaker is Bruce Moss, a close personal friend of Keith's and a former colleague in the deer management program at the Wisconsin DNR.
Well, I first heard about not Keith McCaffery directly, but certainly the deer research program in Wisconsin way back in my university days at Minnesota, because Wisconsin has long been recognized as, if not the best state for deer management, certainly one of the best. And I got the chance to experience just how good that is as a wildlife manager in the 70s. But when I first met Keith and began a 25-year close relationship with him was in the early 1980s. And Keith actually retired before those 25 years were up, but fortunately for me, he flunked retirement and came to the office every day, and against the objections from Madison, where they felt I should deal with the new deer biologists, I continued to work with Keith because I was so comfortable with his extreme knowledge of deer and deer management. Like I say, I worked with Keith, and prior to that, I was a wildlife manager and primarily focused in a part of the state that had few deer and was primarily concerned with waterfowl management, pheasant management, and this sort of thing. So while I got to dabble in the proper deer management that was done in Wisconsin, I basically did not know a lot about it. And then I became the wildlife staff specialist for the Northwest District, which is 12 counties in northwestern Wisconsin. And suddenly I was thrown into the Northern Forest Deer Management Program, which in Northwest Wisconsin was led by probably some of the best deer biologists or wildlife managers in the state. And me being a primarily wetlands prairie manager had a strong learning curve if I was going to be able to advise these managers on deer management. And Keith was such a great mentor and educator that he made me look very good over the next 25 years because we had frequent discussions. And as a keen educator, he took great lengths to explain what he was recommending or what he thought we should do. And I had no qualms about stealing his thoughts and relaying them to the managers. And I'm sure many of them felt that I was right from the get-go a pretty good qualified deer manager. And I must say, after 25 years of working with him, I felt I was too, but I started out rather slowly. Like I mentioned, Keith was a mentor, and he and I worked together literally 12 months of the year, almost on a weekly basis, because Many people think about deer management as the deer seasons and quota setting and so forth, but I'm sure managers recognize it really is a year-round involvement. And Keith, rather than take his expertise and try to be dictatorial, would work with people like me and wildlife managers on setting up deer registration stations, deer aging stations, setting deer quotas, and all the things that go into managing the deer herd. And beyond the science, which I'm sure this award will cover in detail, and I won't go into, wildlife management and wildlife biology also has a lot of art involved with it. And Keith was a professional about the art of this. I'll give you an example. Winter severity indexes, anybody can literally look at this index at the end of the winter and say, oh, we had a mild winter, that means such and such, or we had a severe winter or whatever. And Keith would understood and made sure that we understood that just strictly the number had to be interpreted, and he was a professional at that. He knew that for bucks and for fawns, December was important. You didn't want a lot of snow and cold when bucks were coming out of the rut. And January and February, deer had evolved to take just about what winter threw at them, so he wasn't overly concerned about it. But come March and April, when the fetuses are developing in the does, and suddenly severe winter can really wreak havoc with them. So this sort of thing was this interpretation of deer issues and management issues, research issues, was something that Keith worked diligently with us so that we understood what we were finding out and how to interpret it. Drawing a blank again, just a second. And like I mentioned previously, that we were very frequently in touch with one another. And one of the things that always was interesting to me, and it showed how he involved people other than just himself in deer management, was the day after the gun deer season, I would expect a call from Keith, and he would want me to rate the huntability of the 9-day deer season. And on a scale of 1 to 10, what was it? And what days were particularly huntable, which ones were bad. And he did the same thing with my counterpart in northeast Wisconsin, Arlen Lumens. And so between the three of us, we would come up with a number of that. It was a 7 or an 8 or a 10 or a 4 or whatever. And then all the data that was gathered throughout the year was interpreted by the harvest potential of the season, because he, and obviously Arlen and I soon recognized, or in our case, but he knew it all along, was that if we had a lousy opening weekend, we would see a decline in deer harvest that was not reflected in what the actual population of the deer were. And so these sort of things were always very important in interpreting what was happening, and to make sure that we had a good understanding of what the deer herd was. And this may sound like a eulogy, but I will guarantee you that while Keith is finally retired, he has not given up on deer management. Whenever I read an article that let's say, points out the 5 best states in the country to hunt deer because there are so many, I expect that I will see an email within hours where Keith will say that these 5 states are overpopulated with deer and are really not the healthiest deer herds in the country, but that hunters look at as not as good hunting or actually have a much healthier deer herd in what he's trying to perpetuate. And in teaching us to manage the deer herd, his education is more laid back than certainly a professor. I can remember him coming up with such sayings as, deer management is simple. You need to feed them grass in the summer and lead in the fall. And of course, what he was saying is you need deer quotas to keep deer at population goals. And he was stressing that summer deer habitat is much more important than winter deer habitat, even though over the years he did look at, obviously deer yards and so forth. He also wanted us to understand that managing for proper summer deer range was the most important thing to do for the herd.
Now we'll hear from Ron Eckstein, retired Wisconsin DNR biologist and a friend of Keith's.
Hello, my name is Ron Eckstein, and I am a retired DNR wildlife biologist. Keith was born 86 years ago in Stanley, a small agricultural community in Chippewa County. As a high school student, Keith walked to school with his .22 caliber rifle. He kept the rifle in his school locker. It would hunt white-tailed jackrabbits on the way home. Keith continued the habit of taking guns to school when he and Josie were at St. Olaf's College in Minnesota. They both kept .22 rifles in their dorm rooms and hunted cottontails on the college campus. Keith says Josie was, by far, the better shot. Well, the jackrabbits are long gone, and so is the era of keeping hunting rifles in school lockers. Keith's dad was on the Wisconsin Conservation Congress for over 30 years, and he advised Keith to, quote, find a job you like doing in your spare time. During college and the early years in state service, Keith and Josie moved 8 times in 5 years. Then in 1967, they purchased a home that Keith calls his, quote, urban cottage at 729 Brun Street in Rhinelander. They still call that urban cottage home. From his home, it was, quote, a 3-minute run from bed to office. Keith made that 3-minute run for over 50 years, and believe it or not, never drove a vehicle to work. To this day, Keith can be seen walking and running all over Rhinelander in all kinds of weather. Now, Keith's office was at the Rhinelander Ranger Station. The station was a 2-story 1921 era building that sat on a knoll overlooking the junction of the Pelican and Wisconsin rivers. Each desk had a double window overlooking the water. It was definitely one of the most aesthetic settings of any state office. And actually, the best view was from the upstairs restroom, which also had a double wide window overlooking the river. The ranger station had 13 to 14 permanent staff that included research, wildlife, fire control, forestry, and a conservation warden. The second floor was occupied by the wildlife research group of Bill Creed, Bruce Kahn, Jimmy Ashbrenner, and Keith McCaffery, as well as 2 wildlife management staff and assorted dogs. I remember life at the ranger station as collegial, with a free flow of information among all the staff. There were no silos. Everyone helped keep each other as best they could. Keith refers to some of the ranger station crew as, quote, great conversationalists who often engaged in lengthy discussions and debates on deer management. Local people came to the ranger station for a variety of reasons, not always positive. One day in particular, a very large and very angry deer hunter walked in and said he wanted to punch Keith McCaffery in the nose. Keith, hearing the angry shouts, quickly opened his upstairs window, just in case he had to, quote, escape to the roof. Fortunately, the deer hunter never made it upstairs because Forester Tim Mulhern escorted the deer hunter out of the office twice. At the Rhinelander Ranger Station, Keith and the Forest Wildlife Research Group developed the best in the nation science on deer habitat, deer populations, and deer harvest management. In particular, Keith was known as a strong advocate for sticking to the science and always fought hard against those who wanted to dismiss the science and bend to political winds. Keith spent 37 years in pay status and another 20 years as an official DNR volunteer, following his dad's advice, doing the work he liked. Keith often described those 20 years of volunteer work as a failed retirement. However, we all know he loved every minute of it. To quote UW-Madison wildlife professor Tim Van Deelen, Keith is the living institutional memory of Wisconsin's professional deer management program. I was fortunate to be in the same DNR office building with Keith for 36 years. It is my great pleasure and privilege to know Keith, both as a dedicated research scientist and as a friend. Congratulations to Keith on his well-deserved honor of entering the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame.
On behalf of the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame Board of Directors, Board of Governors, and our voting member organizations, it is my honor to formally announce the induction of Keith McCaffery into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. At this time, we would like to acknowledge this special legislative citation in honor of Keith McCaffery's induction into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. And now we will hear from Keith himself as he shares some special words about his life and career in Wisconsin.
I remain amazed and a bit stunned, but I'm happy to be here. When I think about my career, especially the early part of my career, I'm reminded of an early colleague, Cliff Germain, who celebrated the fact that he was hired out of the clouds of World War II at the Conservation Department at a time when the American public was really enthusiastic about doing things for good things for the environment. He called that good timing. I too stepped out of school in the shadow of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And the early part of my career coincided with the environmental renaissance that followed. Again, that was good timing. I also think of the word vocation. The vocation has roots in being a calling or a gift from God. Like growing a Christian faith, success rarely occurs by individual effort or any kind of a competition. It usually takes a community. And I worked alongside some amazing people. There's a proverb that says, I've been warmed by campfires I didn't light, and I've drunk from wells I didn't dig. And I'd like to acknowledge some of my well diggers and fire lighters that helped me succeed to this point. That still surprises me. Well, Robert Raleigh was a good DNR friend who tried his very best to turn me into a real scientist. And he made a number of recommendations. I can recall one where he suggested that I resist editorializing, that is, interjecting my personal opinion while I was presenting scientific findings. He suggested stick with the data. Tim Van Deelen also invited me to share his DNR office when he was here shortly after my retirement. without knowing what effect that gesture was going to have on me. But in the short years that he worked for DNR, I learned a lot from him. But he and his UW graduate students have continued to be an inspiration to me going forward. Carl Martin started out as a co-worker and soon became my supervisor. And he heaped all kinds of encouragement and recognition on me that boosted my confidence and kept my fires burning. Bill Creed was our Forest Wildlife Research Group leader, and he was a smart fellow, and he hired some prize-winning biologists like Bruce Kahn and John Kubishik, with whom I was able to work for most of my career, and that was a real double bonus for me. Bill also had to give us required annual personal evaluations, and on 2 occasions, separated probably by a year or more, he asked me, "Why can't you be more like Jerry Bartelt?" This is just a little unusual, but what Bill didn't know and what I didn't tell him was that Jerry had been one of my role models from the very first time I became acquainted with him. And apparently I wasn't doing such a good job of modeling that he had to ask me twice, but I surely thank Jerry Bartelt for being there. Larry Goldke was a conservation congressman, a good friend, and he boasted of being a deer nerd. Early in his career, he had been a math teacher, and so he really knew numbers. And he came around and volunteered to assist me tabulating and analyzing thousands of deer ages each year. He did that for many years. And he was also a cheerleader when he attended the DNR Deer Committee meetings. Another cheerleader was Pat Durkin, outdoor writer. My mother really wanted to adopt him as a 4th son because she really appreciated the way he wrote and the way he supported our deer program. Even in times of controversy at personal risk, he defended the program, and I very much appreciated that. Larry Goldke was well, yes, he was a standout for me. Wildlife manager Ron Eckstein had a room adjoining ours in the old ranger station. And he had distinguished himself working on eagles and ospreys, but he was also an expert when it came to wildlife habitats and silviculture. It didn't take long for us to informally adopt him as an adjunct scientist to our research group. There was a pleasurable addition, and we borrowed a lot of information from Ron. Dad and I were fishing one evening, and our conversation drifted off to future topics. He said, when you think about some kind of a career, he says, forget about the money. Think about what you like to do in your spare time, and then find a job like that. I did. Thanks, Dad. Also want to thank my wife, Josie. She was a great enabler, caregiver, and put up with my antics for over 65 years. I couldn't ask for a better partner or enabler, and I really appreciate that. Our 2 children, Aurora and Mark, they accompanied me on a number of woodcock surveys, among other things, and they also put up with my occasional work absences from home. I also want to thank those who provided endorsements and put together the nomination, especially Dave Judson and Susie Hickey Nails. I also thank the Hall of Fame Board of Governors for bestowing this recognition on me. I thank those who also did some preparations to put this presentation event together. Wife Josie once gave me a framed piece of birch bark on which said, happiness is doing what you love. Contentment is loving what you do. I still have that, and I very much experienced that during my entire career. I would wish that would be the case for everyone. And I wish everyone could recognize that their own vocation is a gift from above. I also thank the wildlife supervisors around the state. They were located at Green Bay, Madison, Eau Claire, Spooner, Rhinelander. And it was always fun to work with them, negotiate harvest quotas each year. Bruce Moss was one of those representatives. He came out of Spooner, and he's president of the program tonight. And he was one of my role models as well for the way he handled people. And he also did something that sticks in my mind. While bow hunting, he was able to shoot a buck fawn that field dressed at 110 pounds. And that's a pleasant memory to have and something that I'm never going to achieve. Now, I've lived in embarrassment of riches, and it's been topped off by this huge honor. And I thank you all very much.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's ceremony, and we thank you for joining and participating. Next time you're enjoying the abundant wildlife of Wisconsin, or perhaps a successful deer hunt, we hope you'll acknowledge Keith McCaffery and his important work as a deer biologist in our wonderful state. To learn more about the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame, you can visit us online at WCHF.org. There you can watch this ceremony again if you'd like, and you can also read more about Keith's work as well as the work of our other inductees. We hope you'll consider making a donation while you're there so that we can continue to support and acknowledge the icons of Wisconsin conservation for many years to come. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful evening.